You are in for a treat. This is a special episode of the Patrick Coffin Show. We're going to go deep into the rich tradition of biblical prayer, mystical theology, how to change your life through invoking the presence of God with my dear friend and hero in life, David Torkington. But first, before we begin that conversation, I want to invite you to join True North. If you like exposing media narratives, if you like connecting the dots and see the big picture of how we got to this cultural and ecclesial crisis, check out patrickcoffin.media. We have members in multiple countries. We have a great time finishing each other's sentences. Most of us are Catholic. You don't have to be Catholic to join, but why risk it? patrickcoffin.media is the spot to go to find out more about the community, True North, also my pilgrimages, this podcast, a blog, and much else besides. David Torkington is a British author, mystical theologian, teacher of prayer, author of many, many books. We're going to begin with his Passport to Perfection, and it's a great honor to speak with David Torkington once again. Hello, sir.
Hello, Patrick. Nice to meet you again.
You and I spoke on the Hope is Fuel Catholic on Purpose event, and people who consumed all that content
Correct.
still talk about how they didn't see you coming. You've been at this for these 50 years now, and it's a great honor to
a bit more than that.
Over 50 years plus. Our dear friend and mutual collaborator Ryan Moreau introduced me to you. I think I've seen your name on a title or maybe endorsing another book, but it was such an honor to do a deep dive into someone that I should have, because I'm quite an avid reader, and this is kind of my sweet spot. But you're one of those treasures that have stayed hidden for long enough. Thank you. See, that was meant to humiliate and embarrass you. Next up, I'll call you a saint, and then we'll really stop it down.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to look humble.
I am an expert at humility. I'm fantastic at it. Yes. Let's go back to when you were younger, and you've been very frank about your dyslexic. I guess it wasn't diagnosed at the time. What did they call dyslexia when you were a teenager? Lazy?
They didn't call it anything. Would you believe it? I didn't know I was dyslexic until I was in my 40s. Met a doctor who said, "But you're dyslexic." And that explained the whole of my life. I just thought at school I was written off as either being lazy or stupid. Now, I knew that I wasn't stupid, so I just assumed that I must be bone idle, just be lazy. And yet, funnily enough, when in later life I found I'd mastered most of the other deadly sins, I'd never actually mastered sloth.
How did your dyslexia manifest itself? Was it words backwards, words out of orders?
Reading and writing. Yeah. We're living in a world today when many people, who don't happen to be brilliant at every subject say, I'm a bit dyslexic when it comes to maths, or geometry or that sort of thing. No, reading and writing, and there are degrees of dyslexia. I was about 40 degrees below zero, because even though I spent almost 11 years at a grammar school, I was in my early 20s before I could read or write with every fluency. I saw it always, and have always seen it, at least for many, many years, as being the curse of my life. But now, looking back with hindsight, it is the greatest blessing that I've ever had. Remember what St. Paul said, first to pen this great secret of the spiritual life. God's power finds scope in weakness. And this is a theme that you get going right through the Old Testament, beginning with Abraham, Moses, I won't detail it because it would take too long, but the very rock upon which the church was founded was denying Christ 3 times shortly before he died. God's power finds scope strangely in weakness. That's why, in hindsight, I look back and say, my dyslexia is the greatest gift that I have ever been given, because without it, I wouldn't have desperately turned to God in prayer and persisted, because no one else could help me. I knew only He could. And it's because of that that prayer became so important in my life. No, I was not a childhood saint. I became a spiritual theologian because I gave myself totally to prayer, and I persisted when everybody else gave up because they had other opportunities. They had diplomas to get, they had degrees at university, they had futures, ambitions, and so on. I hadn't. God was my only hope. So I hung on like grim death, come hell or high water.
I believe J.R.R. Tolkien would refer to that as a eucatastrophe, EU catastrophe. The thing that was catastrophic at the time that led you through perseverance to overcome it. It's almost like a fall upward, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And your writing is so clear and simple. Your prose is very, very lean. When did you discover you had a gift for putting words together in a way that resonates with readers and listeners for your retreats?
Well, I didn't really. And it's only in more recent times that I've sort of realized that I do have a gift of simplification. But the answer to that again is dyslexia. Because in order to understand something, I had to break it down and make it very simple for me. And so in making it very simple for myself, it seems I've been able to make it very simple for other people too.
At what age did your priestly vocation kick in? You had a brother who was a Franciscan, and you felt the call to a religious life. How did that come about? Was that through the influence of your brothers?
Well, it came 17, 18, when I suddenly decided I couldn't go on any longer with this terrible affliction. I didn't know what it was. In the school that I went to, they'd never heard of dyslexia. So I didn't know what was wrong with me. And so the only thing I thought I could do was to turn to God in prayer, because a retreat master said, God knows everything, even our most secret thoughts. So I thought, well, He knows what's wrong with me. So I turned to prayer and took it very seriously. Why? Not because I was particularly pious. I wasn't. I needed healing. I wanted to know what was wrong with me. And it was from that, therefore, I came to realize that I had a vocation to the priesthood, and I joined the Franciscan order.
The OFMs.
The OFM, yeah.
Who was it that said, in kind of poo-pooing mysticism as somehow suspect, it starts in mist and ends in schism? Do you know the origin of that?
Where did you get that from? I'd be very interested to know, because that was one of the first things that I was told. I think you've pinched it from me, and you're now regurgitating it and taking credit
the good
for it.
borrow, but the great steal. Yes, I saw that on your website.
Yeah. No, it was when I was a student, and I realized that by pushing on and on and on, hour after hour, a change began to happen very deeply within me. And I was looking for help. And I actually said to a fellow student who I thought might understand what was going on. And he said, beware. Mysticism begins in mist and ends in schism. So I didn't go to him any longer. I went to the priest who was teaching theology at the time and sought his help. And then further into the library, I came across two books, The Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa's masterwork, Interior Castle. And I just could not believe what I read. What nobody else understood or could help me with was there in black and white, written down by a Carmelite friar 400 years before, almost explaining exactly what was going on. It was quite a revelation.
Being a Catholic in England is sort of an exotic bird. You come from a recusant family, correct? And that must have had a kind
Yeah.
of solidifying effect, because explain to people what the conditions were like under the recusant era, and what would happen to you if you were spotted having a priest in your home, or refusing to go to Protestant services.
Well, let's go back. Yeah, let's go back now to well, even in the time of Henry VIII, of course, if you challenged his supremacy, it was death. And interestingly enough, I am a direct descendant of Sir Nicholas Tempest, who was hanged, drawn, and quartered in London at a place called Tyburn in the year 1537, a direct descendant. And I'm also descended from many others who spent a long time in jail. But it was really under Elizabeth I that she enacted a law which meant this: if you didn't go to the Protestant church and receive communion once a month, you were fined £20, which in modern money would be something between $3,000 and $4,000. It was an awful lot of money. If you didn't pay, then it was jail. And some of the jail conditions were absolutely horrendous. One of the jails, for instance, the Blockhouse Jail in Hull in Yorkshire, was deep down in the castle, in the dungeons of the castle, where the tide came in twice a day. At high tide, it came almost up to your chest. And that went on day after day after day after day, unless you gave in and promised to go to a Protestant church for communion once a month. And all jail conditions, believe me, were horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And of course, if you were caught with a priest in your house, the penalty was death, and he was hanged, drawn, and quartered too. They were appalling times. I mean, Catholics couldn't own land. They couldn't even own a horse. Couldn't ride a horse, or you couldn't own a horse. So the strictures on Catholics were horrendous. So that was, if you like, the background from which I came. So without being an over pious family, it was staunchly Catholic. And certainly had an influence on me wanting to be a priest, because I remember having a fascination with going to old houses and searching out priests' hiding holes. I remember that. And I think probably that triggered something deep down within me saying, I want to follow suit. I want to follow my early forebears.
The climax scene in, I think, the best James Bond film is Skyfall. It takes place in a chapel at the end of a priest hole tunnel. It's the final scene. That's where we learn that Ian Fleming conceived Bond as a Catholic, probably a lapsed Catholic, but Skyfall
really?
references. In fact, the big scene at the end with Dame Judi Dench takes place in a priest hole chapel, I believe in Scotland. So
that I didn't know.
Not very ecumenical times, shall we say?
Hardly. They were very, very difficult times indeed.
Your latest book is Passport to Perfection, another pithy title.
Yeah.
What would the elevator pitch be if a movie were to be made and my name is Frank Capra? How would you phrase why this message for now? What is it about? Because you've written a lot of books from several different angles.
Well, it's not a filmable book, because in many ways I've written about 14 books on prayer and the spiritual life. And what I wanted to do, to finish with almost, was to summarize everything up. Because the only hope for us at the moment is to go back to early Christianity, to the spirituality that Jesus Christ, our Lord, first lived himself before introducing it into the early church. It is precisely a sacrificial, redemptive, and contemplative spirituality. And it is to take people back to that early spirituality and give them a step-by-step guide how to embrace it beginning now, today. So I start with a blueprint for prayer, for morning prayer, evening prayer, prayer during the day, and even set prayers, before then moving on to meditation, and through meditation to contemplation, so that we go through the whole gamut, if you like, of the spiritual journey, but as simply as I possibly can. What I'm very excited about at the moment is only yesterday, a large parish in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, thanks to Father, the parish priest, is actually using this book as a help for a parish retreat. And they're going through it page by page, chapter by chapter, step by step. And that's what it's really meant for, not for making a film. I mean, if you want to make a film, if you have friends, then this is the book to make a film about. Wisdom from the Western Isles. But that's another story. I think we won't go onto that tangent.
There are many pitfalls, that temptations to substitute versions of prayer. The first one that comes to mind is something that's become popular in many parishes at even the diocesan level, and that's centering prayer, according to Thomas Keating and Basil Pennington and William something.
Yes.
Very well. Keating comes out with it, may he rest in peace. That it's really a Catholic version of Tatoi Masi. I am the inner being. I am God. That's the terminus point. It's not so much a participation in grace as a kind of navel gazing, warmed over Hinduism. Am I overplaying the card here?
No, I'm just laughing because that's where the church has just come, isn't it? Just discovered that man is the God. The synodality has just discovered that man is God. Thank you very much. But that's another question. Yeah, it's almost going back to the pantheism of the Rhineland mystics, or one of them in particular, Meister Eckhart. But let me, before we move away from this, let me make it quite clear that mantra movements has got nothing whatsoever to do with Christian prayer. Though its adherents will never fail to go back to the Desert Fathers and try to prove and show how it is quite simply mental yoga. By using a word or a phrase to sedate the inner mind. Of course, it is possible to do that. In the National Health Service in this country, it is used for people who are suffering mental problems. They teach them transcendental meditation, to calm down, to experience inner peace, you see. But this has got nothing whatsoever to do with Christian prayer, which is the raising of the heart and the mind to God, coming to know and love God by discovering him in the person of Jesus Christ our Lord. It begins with meditation, not with flinging oneself into states of transcendental awareness, or to calming states, or to mindfulness, etc. Fine, if you've got psychiatric problems, they may be helpful for you, and we all have problems at some stage in our life, but it's nothing to do with Catholic prayer. And I'm afraid it really just shows the spiritual bankruptcy of the monks on both sides of the Atlantic who've been promoting it. And I was about to say their tradition. It's not, in fact, their tradition. They've misunderstood, misread their own tradition. It is purely a method of mental yoga, period.
This brings to mind another influential, I think, false substitute, at least in his later writings, and that's the Trappist monk Thomas Merton, whose Seven-Story Mountain kind of roared onto the scene in the 1940s. Bishop Sheen called it the 20th Century Confessions. I think it's a magnificent book. And then he has another one called New Seeds of Contemplation, and some Some of his early work seemed to be very solid, but Merton spun off into the enthusiasm of the 60s and became very,
Correct.
to me, syncretistic and not at all trustworthy.
Yeah, I was actually giving a retreat to the Cistercians at of Mbengwe in the Cameroon. And talking with the monks there, they said towards the end of his life, he completely lost it, which made them ask the question, did he ever have it in the first place? Or was he just a very good journalist?
Yes. Can you give a summary of the three ways of the spiritual life, the beginner, the proficient, and the perfect? Because it's sort of a sub-theme, and
No, I really think, Patrick, it's really misleading. I know Garrigou-Lagrange based his books on that, but you see, the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way, let's face it, for the vast majority of people, even who experience prayer of quiet and full union and so forth that St. Teresa of Avila talks about, they're still in the purgative way, right up to the point of what the Eastern Church calls theosis. And I've never met anybody who is not in the purgative way. And I've spent very, very many years giving retreats and lectures on the spiritual life all over the world. So virtually we're all, so it's a misnomer to believe that, for the first 3 or 4 years we're in the purgative way. Then all of a sudden we start having experiences in prayer and we move into the illuminative way. I just don't think that it is helpful. The three ways actually come from a gentleman, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, called Dionysius the Areopagite, who operated around the year 500 after the death and resurrection of our Lord. He was, in fact, many people believe a heretic. He was pretending that he was the Areopagite mentioned by St. Paul as the first bishop of Athens. And he pretends that he knew St. Peter and St. Paul, Titus, and he knew also Our Lady. He wasn't actually there at the death of Christ, but he remembers the earthquake, etc., and etc., etc. He really does lay it on to give himself credence, and then he develops a mystical theology virtually without Christ. And here I am quoting the famous Jesuit historian Copleston. Christ, he said, plays no part at all in his theology. It is virtually Neoplatonism dressed up as Christianity so that he can gain a wider audience. He develops this idea and is picked up by people later, picked up by Garrigou-Lagrange, whose book, of course, is excellent, but I just don't happen to find that it is helpful to talk about, first of all, going through purgation, illumination, and union. I don't find it helpful. Maybe it's a big subject and too big to go into now. Unless you want to.
That's fair enough, because it's very tempting to constantly gauge where you are. Am I through the purgative yet? Am I still in the beginner yet? Is this depression or this trial in my life? Is this the dark night of the senses? Is it the dark night of the soul? I think it lends itself to over introspection.
Exactly, and let me tell you this quite clearly: that unless you come to the point of forgetting yourself in the spiritual life, you won't get anywhere. If you are continually looking at your watch and saying, when is the prayer of quiet going to come? When am I going to have an ecstasy? I can assure you, you are going nowhere at all. Why? Because that is spiritual cupboard love. You're only in it for what you get out of God. So you will be going nowhere at all. Believe me, the time has to come as you persevere when you give yourself totally to God, abandon yourself to him, whatever you're feeling, whatever you're experiencing, and you're prepared to take up your daily cross in prayer, centering your heart and mind upon him and on him alone, not what you get out of it.
I want to ask you two follow-up questions right there, and I hope it doesn't take us off our main river. You mentioned Meister Eckhart. I was presented with a few books about and by him when I was an undergraduate, and most of my professors were pretty hard left, dissenting, kind of priests who left their vows to get married and decided they wanted to continue teaching. So I had a full education in the enthusiasms of the 60s and 70s. Dissent, where you can disagree with anything and still be a faithful Catholic. And Meister Eckhart was interesting to me because he seemed to almost like Buddhist koans, these riddles. They struck me as mind candy,
right.
And there was always something unsettling about reading his work. He seemed to extend analogies too far, and I could never quite. It was like trying to pin Jello to the wall. Just what are your thoughts on Meister Eckhart and his influence?
Well, one, I don't know a lot about Eckhart because he was quite clearly, I didn't bother when I discovered that, that he was actually not that distinct from the modern day transcendental, those who practice transcendental meditation. And he certainly was condemned at the time by Pope John the 22nd, although theologians today play it down and say, not really, and of course he didn't really mean it, and he's really kosher. He's not kosher. He certainly fell into pantheism. So I didn't really waste my time reading all his work. I'm far more interested in reading the work of authentic, genuine Catholic
Would you
mystics.
put the cloud of unknowing in that category? How would you assess that?
Now, this is a very interesting work, really, the cloud of unknowing, because of the mantra movement. That is their Bible. Because in it, he suggests, and only in contemplation, let me be quite clear about this, not in meditation, not beforehand, only when you are genuinely in contemplation, which is, let me make it quite clear, a pure gift of God. It is only there that the cloud of unknowing begins. And knowing that in this very difficult time, we are surrounded by temptations and distractions that come from the world that we've just left and the world to which we are returning. And in that endeavor to help us keep our mind fixed, and these are his words, on naked intent upon God, he suggests using a single word like love, because it's God's love that we desire more than anything else, or a word like sin, because it's sin that we want to avoid like anything else, and repeating it over and over again. This is not a mantra, not a mantra at all. It's merely an aid to do two things at the same time. One, keeping your mind fixed upon God, lovingly upon God in the darkness, and trying at the same time to smother the distractions under what he calls a cloud of forgetfulness. And he uses a medieval imagery. He says that the word you are using, repeating, is like a spear or a lance. This is medieval imagery that you use to pierce through what appears to be a cloud of unknowing that seems at the beginning of the mystic way to betwixt thee and thy maker. The word helps you to keep your heart's desire fixed on God by using this word. So it's not a mantra. You're helping it to keep your love, your heart's desire, your will fixed on God, while at the same time using the word as a shield to parry the distractions and temptations and put them under a cloud of forgetfulness. I think it is a brilliant work, but many people today, even otherwise orthodox, are condemning this book because they think it is leading you back to the mantra people and to the mantra movement. It is not. Read the introduction, where he actually says, you must hide this book from beginners. Beginners mustn't be given this book. It is dangerous to give it to them because you don't start there. It is only when you are called into contemplative prayer. That's when the book begins. And quite apart from that teaching that I've just explained to you, the book is full of profound wisdom. And that's one of the ways you know this isn't just a here today and gone tomorrow spiritual book, full of profound wisdom. Because if somebody is an authentic mystic, then they come to know and experience what St. Thomas Aquinas calls the fruits of contemplation, perhaps the most important of which is wisdom. And this book is chock full of wisdom. I am at the moment trying to find somebody, please get in touch with me if you can do it, to translate this book from Middle English into modern English. And now I'm going to write an introduction to it. I'm at the moment looking for somebody. But there are unfortunately some people who condemn it today who should know better.
How does wisdom distinguished from intellectual or being smart?
Well, because I should have prefaced the word wisdom with the word infused wisdom. Because in contemplation, as you are traveling on seemingly in darkness and to begin with seemingly getting nowhere, if you continue and you are following what the cloud of unknowing says, and you continually try to keep your heart and mind open to God, even in the darkness, surrounded by temptations and distractions, your will is open to God and therefore open to receive what St. Thomas Aquinas calls the fruits of contemplation. The infused virtues, gifts, and fruits of the Holy Spirit. It is already happening, but a beginner doesn't know this. It is only later when they look back on their lives, in hindsight, they see that though it was dark and they thought they were going nowhere, they were in fact receiving divine wisdom, infused wisdom that enabled them to understand more clearly the spiritual life for themselves and for other people. So the infused virtues are, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, the fruits of contemplation. And the more you persevere in contemplative prayer, the more you receive them and in ever greater fullness. These gifts come all wrapped up in God's love. Everything comes in God's love. As you are open to receive God's love, then within God's love, let's imagine it this way. Imagine God's love as a shaft of light that strikes the human heart as a prism. Now, just as ordinary, this was I think it was Isaac Newton who discovered this, that when a shaft of light strikes a prism, it refracts and bends, and you see all the colors of the rainbow. The same thing happens with God's love. All God does, he loves us all the time with what the Greek fathers called the pleroma, the cornucopia of his love. And when we are open to that love in contemplative prayer, then God's love strikes the human heart, and then you see refracted in human behavior the infused virtues. the cardinal virtues, infused cardinal virtues, the infused moral virtues, the infused theological virtues that I should have said first and foremost, and then further gifts of the Holy Spirit. And that's what you see in the early days of Christianity, to a degree that you see at no later time in Christian spirituality. That's why these ordinary Christian faithful who never heard of monks and monasteries, the heart and soul of everything was the Christian family. There they learned to love God. There they learned contemplation. There they learned the fruits of contemplation that enable them to generate within themselves and in their family a quality of love that the pagan world had never seen before. And so they were able to conquer a pagan world, to make it a Christian world in such a short time that it still baffles secular historians.
A lot of the content of my commentaries and interview guests and all the things I do on YouTube have to be heavily censored by me. To get the full iteration, unfiltered, uncensored, go to the True North Movement. That's patrickcoffin.media. You'll find an extra episode. You'll find all the activities around the water cooler, our main community chat. We do books, we do movies, we do culture, faith, and reason. So get the entire conversation uncensored from YouTube. Go to patrickcoffin.media.